Hello and welcome to the MBOM podcast, where you will learn to master the business of yoga with guests from around the world who have experienced becoming successful yoga teachers, studio owners, and much more. Now, here's your host, Amanda Kingsmith.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the MBOM podcast. I'm Amanda and I'll be your host for this and all episodes of the show. I am so excited for today's episode of the podcast because it is a solo episode and I am going back through 2019 and doing the 2019 year in review. And this is one of my favorite episodes of the year because it means that I get to sit down and reflect on the past year. And I find that for me, so much gratitude comes out of doing these episodes. Before we dive into the episode, just a quick word from some of our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you in part by Offering Tree. When you're a yoga teacher and you're trying to build your digital presence, it can be daunting. First, you might need a website. There are a lot of great tools for building websites like WordPress, Wix, and Squarespace. Then you need a way to email your students. Again, there are tools for that like MailChimp and Constant Contact, but that's another account to pay for and a password to remember. Then you need a way to schedule and register your students. Again, there are tools for that, but it's another account to create and pay for and another password to remember. Oh wait, how do I integrate my scheduling tool with my website? There are so many things to remember. So instead of putting all of this stuff off for another day because it's too daunting, let me tell you about a better way. Offering Tree set out to make creating your digital presence fun, easy, and affordable. With one account, you can create a website in minutes that has your schedule built right in. They also have email marketing tools to collect email addresses, send newsletters, and automated emails to your subscribers. It all works seamlessly together with one account and one subscription. To learn more about what Offering Tree can do for your digital presence, visit offeringtree.com/MBOM. Offering Tree has been supporting MBOM for close to a year now, and I not only love the product, but I also love the people. The team at Offering Tree is super awesome. They are a small business just like you and me, and they have great customer service for anything that you need. And Offering Tree is providing special pricing for MBOM listeners, so be sure to visit offeringtree.com/MBOM to receive your discount. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you in part by FavYogis. The FavYogis app is back with new features for teachers that let you create and manage your own private classes while making payment and registration a breeze. Do you have regular private clients? Make life easier with autopay. Forget about remembering to Venmo, or if you're Canadian, try some sort of e-transfer or PayPal combination. You can use autopay to enable repeat payments and keep calendars in sync with classes. Google Calendar integration automatically updates teachers and student classes when you make changes. It's still just your yoga. Teachers add classes, students add teachers, and teachers and students stay connected. So head on over to the App Store on your device and find FavYogis. It's FavYogis. On top of that, it's totally free to download and give a try. So head on over to your App Store and find FavYogis. FavYogis. Oh, and make sure you use code MBOM and let them know that I sent you. And of course, a huge thank you to Offering Tree and FavYogis for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. And a huge thank you to you for going and checking them out and listening to what they have to say. I only ever partner with companies that I genuinely love and use. And I love both of these small businesses and what they can offer you in your yoga business. All right, diving into the 2019 year in review, it was really fun to sit down and reflect on this. And it's really fun because my husband and I also do this for our travel podcast. So we sat down a couple of weeks ago now and reflected on 2019 from our joint perspective and from our travel perspective. And so when I sat down to think about this one, I originally didn't think about my travels, but the reality is that my travels are such a huge part of what I do and such a huge part of my business. At this point, I am entirely remote. I don't have to be in any one location to do anything that I do, and that's a huge blessing. But it's also a challenge at times, and it means that, this year was really busy in a really, really great way. So I kicked off 2019 in my favorite city in the world, which is Mexico City. We spent Christmas and New Year's there last year, and we were there for a couple of weeks before we headed down to Guatemala. And we spent a month in Antigua, Guatemala, and then we spent a weekend in Lake Atitlan. And for those of you who haven't been to that area of the world, it is so beautiful. Antigua was a really great nomad spot. They have a great yoga studio and a couple great gyms there and tons of great food. So that was a really awesome place to spend a month. And then Lake Atitlan is somewhere that you may have heard about because there's lots of people that offer yoga retreats in the area, specifically normally in San Marcos, but there's lots of little towns around the lake that are really, really beautiful. And this was just a really exceptional place to spend a weekend. And we were actually there celebrating my husband finishing up his job that he was working. And it was kind of interesting because him and I went through a little bit of a career change this year where he stepped out of the job he was doing and into full-time freelance. And shortly after that, we went back home to Canada and I did my 300-hour teacher training, which I'll talk more about in a couple of minutes. And it just made my life so insane. So we went through this kind of big swap in terms of our level of busyness. But before we went back to Canada, we actually celebrated my 30th birthday in Puerto Escondido in Mexico, which is officially my favorite beach town in Mexico, at least so far. It's in the state of Oaxaca, so it's kind of in the southwest corner, and it is just a really great place. And so we got to spend a couple days in Mexico City on either side of that, which, as you guys know, I really, really love Mexico City. So that was really great. Then I got to turn 30 in Puerto Escondido, and then we flew back to Canada. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a couple of years, then you know I haven't been back to Canada in the winter for a while. And so I was a little bit nervous about going back in February, but I wanted to do this teacher training program, and it was the only time that they offered it. So I was like, whatever, I either go or I don't do it. So obviously I decided to go. And the teacher training program was based in Vancouver in British Columbia. And this is a city that I've spent time visiting before, but I'd never lived before. My training program was 3 months long. It was 3.5 days every single week. And so I really felt like I got to immerse myself in the city, and it was awesome. The winter was not nearly as bad as where I'm from, a province over in Alberta. It was totally mild by the time we got there in February, and I have lots of friends in Vancouver, so I got to do lots of cool things like outdoor activities and snowshoeing and going into the mountains where there was some snow, but then getting to experience the city where honestly most of the time it already felt like spring. Plus, I got to be in this amazing teacher training program. So I'm going to continue the where I went part, and then I'm going to come back to the teacher training program because I want to talk a little bit more in depth about that program and some of my biggest key takeaways and learnings and that sort of thing. So after the 3 months that we spent in Vancouver, we headed back to Canmore, which is my home in Canada. It's in the beautiful Rocky Mountains of Western Alberta. And this is essentially where I'm from. It's an hour outside of where I actually grew up, just outside of Calgary, but it's definitely home for me in Canada. And we spent 3 months there. So we actually spent 6 months of this year in Canada, which was pretty crazy. And I know that that doesn't sound that crazy, but when you travel full time, 6 months in your home country is a lot. And I think that it was a really good balance for us because we'd spent the 3 months in Vancouver before. And of course, it's always really great to be home, especially in the summer months. So we spent a wonderful 3 months at home. I taught a ton. We got to go to a really good friend's wedding, which was amazing. And then we actually got married. So my now husband and I had been together for 10.5 years, and everyone had kind of stopped asking when we were going to get married. And then we just showed up married one day. So we had a really beautiful, intimate elopement ceremony. We had the very minimum of people required, which in Alberta is 2 witnesses. And we got married by the river in Canmore, and that was definitely a highlight of being home and certainly a highlight of my year for me. And it's definitely made me feel like I'm all grown up now. So I turned 30 and got married, and yeah, just kind of felt like a lot, but in a really, really good way. Continuing on, September hit and we made our way down to Mexico. This time we based ourselves in Guadalajara, which is in the state of Jalisco. And that's the state where Puerto Vallarta is. It's the state where tequila is. We got to go see how tequila was made while we were there, which was really awesome. And then after our 2 months there, we did a little bit of Mexican travel. We went up to Monterrey, which is a new city for us. And then we went to Mexico City for Ryan, my husband's birthday. He turned 30 and we went there for Day of the Dead, where we had a couple of friends in town. So that was super awesome. And then from there, we flew down to Costa Rica and I co-hosted my first international yoga retreat with my friend Megan Farrell from Balance by Megan. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. And that was so fun. Costa Rica is so awesome. And Ryan and I decided to spend a couple of weeks in Costa Rica afterwards. So we did a official honeymoon, I guess you could call it. It's always a little weird when you travel full time. It's like, how do you declare something like just a trip that you're on and a honeymoon? But we declared a week of that as a honeymoon. And then we did another week of sort of travel and just working and that sort of thing while we were in Costa Rica. And then we flew down to Panama. And Panama City is going to be where we're going to be based for the next couple of months. So I'll give a little bit more information when I update on 2020, but I'm excited for a little bit more stability. But before I dove into that, we spent a crazy couple of weeks looking for an apartment here. And then I flew back home to Canada to surprise my family for Christmas. I didn't actually stay for Christmas, so I guess it was a pre-Christmas surprise. But I wanted to go spend some time with some close family and friends and see my parents and that sort of thing. And it was a really great trip. It was a super cold trip. I ended up with a cold, a super bad cough. I don't know if you guys can hear it in my voice, but I'm still getting over it. And I've been back in Panama for like almost a week now, yet my body is still recovering from all of the crazy travel. And I will be spending the rest of the year in Panama City. So, it's almost the new year and we're just going to have a super relaxing time hanging out in Panama City. So no more travel for 2019. And when I sat down to actually think about 2019 and just how I felt about the year overall, the first word that came to mind for me was busy. And I'm sure you guys can hear that in everything I just talked about. I was on the road a ton. I was doing a ton of things in different places. And it just felt honestly really overwhelming at times. I've really thought deeply about the year though, and I've shifted the thought of busy to the word abundant because I feel like abundance is much more in line with what the year actually was, because the year was so full, but it was so full of so many good things and things that I'm really proud of and things that I'm really excited about and that sort of thing. So a couple of the key highlights or key achievements for me in 2019 that really give me that feeling of fullness and abundance are, one, my yoga teacher training. This was something that I had applied almost a year before for this training, and I'd spent like almost an entire calendar year gearing up for this program because I knew that spending 3.5 days of my week, like 20 hours of my week, 25 hours of my week in teacher training was going to be really hectic because despite what it may look like on the internet, I work pretty much full-time hours, and some weeks I work definitely more than 40 hours a week. And so I had spent, a good part of that time like gearing up to the training, doing a couple of things. One was saving for the program. So I took on a ton of extra work, which made 2018 feel really full. But it also meant that I didn't have to stress as much about the financial side of my training. Two, I was looking at like, what are the things that I need to pass off to somebody? Who do I need to hire, et cetera, et cetera. My husband actually does freelance podcast production, so that was really great because I was able to hire him to do the editing for MBOM because that's one of the things that takes up a lot of time in my week. And I was like, I just am not going to have time for this when I've got, readings and things that I'm going to have to do for homework, and then also wanting to have like a bit of a life and then still keep my business going. So that was one of the major things that I passed off. And then I reshifted my schedule so that I got up early in the morning and cleared out my inbox and did a couple hours of work. And then I used almost all of my lunch breaks during teacher training to, check in, do work, that sort of thing. And then I spent most of my evenings doing work as well. So I would usually work from the time that I finished training at 5. I'd get home around 5:30 and I'd usually work until 7:30-ish, 8, take a break for dinner, maybe do some exercise, maybe read a little bit, and then usually do like 1 more hour or 2 of work before going to bed. So it was like pretty crazy. It was a pretty crazy 3 months, but I am so grateful for that experience. Honestly, the training was so amazing. I did it with the Vancouver School of Healing Arts. So if anybody's in sort of the Pacific Northwest or Western Canada or Canada in general and looking for a great 300-hour, I highly recommend this program. It's really amazing if you work full time, but you've got a little bit of flexibility in your schedule. So honestly, this program was perfect for my schedule and for my lifestyle and for the way that my husband and I live. And it was really great to be in a city that we were curious about and to live in a new city in Canada, because that's something I haven't done for a really long time. And then to reconnect with like friends there and to get to know the yoga community. And there was so much good stuff about it. Diving into the teacher training itself, some of my key takeaways that have really helped me improve my teaching personally have been my language. We focused a lot on direct active language, and I wasn't really aware of how passive my language was as a teacher before. And I think there's a time and a place for passive language when you're teaching, but for the most part, we're really soft as yoga teachers, and I never would have described myself that way, but going through the training, I definitely corrected a ton of my language to be just more direct and more active. I learned a ton about simplifying my words. I think you guys probably know, listening to me talk all the time, I'm not always the most short-winded person. I'm definitely more longer-winded. And I think that there's also, a time and a place for that in a yoga class. But in general, it's really important for us as yoga teachers to be direct, to just tell people what we want them to do in a way that really makes sense. We don't want to confuse them when we're getting them into a pose. We don't want them to be thinking too much, because then that kind of takes away from the experience of their practice. And so that was a really big, major takeaway for me that I think has really improved my teaching. The last thing that I loved about my training was we did a lot of theme work. So for me, one of the reasons that I wanted to do a 300-hour training was to continue learning. I felt like my teaching had become a little bit stagnant, where I was, sequencing really similarly and choosing similar poses and talking about sort of similar things. And I think that there's a lot of power and consistency for your students. But for me, I felt kind of bored of myself and definitely needed to shake things up. And my training really helped with that. We talked a ton about theming around different quotes or topics or seasons or chakras, poses, all that sort of stuff. And so I feel a lot more equipped now to create really unique classes. And if I'm in that mode of teaching something really similar, I feel really confident in being able to switch up my theme and to theme around something totally different, like going from theming around the season to a peak pose. And that is something that feels really interesting to me as a teacher. So those were some of my major takeaways for my 300-hour training. Another big achievement this year that I mentioned was co-hosting my first international yoga retreat. So Megan and I co-hosted our retreat in Nosara, Costa Rica, and this was such a fun week full of so much learning. We had a really great group of people. It ended up being a little bit smaller than we had originally intended, and we had a couple of changes that happened along the way, like before the retreat actually happened, in terms of like where we were having it and that sort of thing. So I think a couple of my major takeaways would be, I think it's really important to go and visit the location of where you're hosting the retreat. I had actually never been to Costa Rica before, but Megan had. However, she hadn't actually been to the location we were going to. And one of the major things that I guess it's not incorrect, but that we kind of didn't realize is that the road to Nosara is really hectic, like really, really bumpy. And we ended up not having the proper vehicles for that. And I think that had we gone there even a week beforehand or a couple of days, we would have quickly been like, oh, we need to upgrade these cars before like the other people who were paying got there. So that was definitely a big learning for me. In the place that we ended up booking, we ended up also doing a lot of the cooking ourselves. And this wasn't like our vision going into the retreat. It's just how it ended up working out with the place that we ended up booking at. And it was great. Like it worked out really well and we were able to lower the price a little bit because of that. But I think that as the host, it's really hard to be the yoga teacher and the chef and the business coach and all those things. So it just makes it really exhausting. For us, fortunately, we had a really great group of people and everyone was super helpful and pitched in and that sort of thing, which took some of the pressure off Megan and I. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's our retreat and we have to make sure that there's a good experience being had by everyone. And I think that getting your food catered or having a chef on site who's like actually a chef is something that's going to really elevate that experience for the participants because it's going to take that pressure off of you. So although everything was really great, I think that that was one of my major learnings as well. But it was really cool. Every day we did yoga facing the ocean, looking out over our pool, and then we would have breakfast and we'd do a business session. And it was totally how I had envisioned the retreat in terms of the business sessions, like being able to be with a group of like-minded people who all work for themselves, who are interested in health and wellness is so, so cool. It is so awesome to get people who want to talk about the work that they do and who are really excited about ideas together. That was one of the things that I had hoped it would be like that, but I wasn't really sure. And that definitely exceeded my expectations in terms of like the quality of conversation that was had and the people that showed up. So that was super, super fun. I haven't decided what my next move is for retreats. It was over a year planning it and finding a spot and then having some changes happening and doing all the marketing for it and lots of back-to-back conversations with Megan and, different places and scouting out locations, et cetera, et cetera. And then the actual like prep time once we, close the registration, then it's creating all of the booklets and all of that sort of stuff. So there is a lot of work involved with it, which I don't mean to sound surprised. I knew that it was going to be a lot of work, but I just haven't quite decided if that's something that I want to tackle again next year or maybe wait a year or two. I think that I'm sort of leaning towards waiting a couple of years before hosting another one, but we shall see. If anyone listening is really interested in this type of retreat, a retreat for yoga teachers, wellness professionals, or just a retreat where we get together and have like-minded people together, definitely let me know because I think that for the next time, I'm really going to gauge it based on interest. And yeah, so if you're interested, definitely just let me know. You can send me an email or a direct message. It's info@mbomyoga.com, or you can just message Mastering the Business of Yoga on Facebook or Instagram. Something else that was a major achievement for me this year was another year of the podcast, obviously. When I started in 2016, it was very much, I didn't have, I guess, like a set plan. I did a number of episodes and then I decided to call that the end of season 1 and I took a little break so I could make more time recording. And then I launched season 2 and I kind of did the same thing. And then I think I launched season 3 like 2.5 years ago and just haven't really stopped. So the way that I was doing the podcast really shifted kind of based on demand and based on sponsorships and based on the number of guests I had and all that good stuff. And I feel so, so, so grateful to be in a position now where I have lots of episodes backlogged and where, sometimes I say no to interviews because I have so many episodes and so many people that I'm having conversations with. And that has been honestly just like one of the best parts of watching this grow. It's so crazy to me that in February of 2020, the podcast is going to be 4 years old. I actually can't believe that and wrap my head around it. But I'm just so excited and amazed and in awe that there's, so many thousands of you out there listening. So this year we put out 54 episodes, including this episode, which I think might be the most episodes ever in a year. I'm closing in on 200 episodes in total. So I think that I'm just shy of that by maybe 15 or 20 or something like that. And so, this year, early into 2020, we're going to be hitting 200 episodes, which is so crazy and so exciting. And I'm just so grateful. So thank you so much for listening and supporting and being a part of the community. I also saw more downloads than ever this year. So at the end of 2018, I can't remember if I shared this on my year in review or not. I think I was around 6,000 downloads per month, and I set a goal for myself to double downloads, and I came really close to hitting that 12,000 per month consistently over the last couple of months. So this year we hit 5 digits in monthly downloads. It happened a couple months into 2019. We had our first 10,000 download month, and that was super exciting to see. It just feels like a really big number, and I'm just amazed that there's so many people who actually want to hear about the business of yoga and feel my passion isn't something that's totally crazy. And those download numbers have been, really consistent throughout the year. And I've seen lots of growth with that too, and lots of consistent growth, which has been really awesome. So we are on track to be, doubling that by the end of this year in the next couple of days. So make sure you keep listening and keep telling your friends and your yoga teacher friends and all that stuff. It's so appreciated. And so I'm doubling that goal for next year. I want to keep seeing downloads double by the end of 2020. I'd really like to be reporting back that I'm over 20,000 downloads per month, and that's consistent as well. So that's what I'm aiming for over this next year. I don't know if that's crazy or not, but we're going to go for it. And I had the pleasure of interviewing so many awesome people in 2019. We kicked off 2019 with an interview with Amber Carnes on body positivity and accessible yoga. And she talks about how we can make people in bigger bodies feel more welcome in our classes. She has an incredible course that she co-hosts with Diane Bondi on accessible yoga. I have a couple of friends who have done it, and it's just really amazing that there's somebody out there having these conversations. We did lots of episodes on things like branding and SEO. And then we also did lots of episodes on studio ownership. And this was probably the year that I talked to the most studio owners maybe ever, which is pretty cool because they've got lots to offer. One of the other things that was really awesome about this year is that I had a lot of repeat guests on the podcast. So Tara Newbigging came back on the show. She was I think my first interview that I ever did. She was definitely the first person that I ever reached out to. She lives in Canmore, where I'm from, and runs a really cool business. And she just opened up a studio. I also had Suzanne Riker back on the podcast to talk about websites. I had Jules Mitchell back on the show to talk about her business. And that was a really fun interview because I actually got to do training with Jules. So I'd met her in person. We'd had a really awesome weekend together. And then we talked about doing another episode, and we really did a deep dive into her business, which was pretty cool because she talks a lot about biomechanics and anatomy and all the work that she does in the yoga industry. And we got to come out of it and do a little bit more conversation on business, which was really awesome. I also had Satara Field back on the podcast to talk about her developing a new brand and her yoga studio that's been open now for 2 years. And I also had Kelly Smith back on the podcast, which was super awesome. I also had lots and lots and lots of new guests. We talked about things from creating online businesses, being a yoga entrepreneur, creating authentic careers, running yoga festivals, working in the fitness industry, the legal side of yoga, which is so important. And I think one of the highlights for my guests this year was I was able to have Jenny Shi on the show, and we talked about building a thriving online yoga business. And it was really cool because right before I got connected with her, I had actually done an online webinar with her through Carrie Green's Women in Entrepreneurship group. And as I was doing it, I was like, oh, this woman's name is really familiar. And then I realized that like, oh, this is a woman I have an interview set up with. And I feel like that sounds really bad, but in my defense, our interview was set up for like a while in the future. And I had Googled her a couple of months before when I'd got the pitch. And then I hadn't done any of my prep for the episode. So that's why I didn't instantaneously recognize it. But Jenny and I had an awesome conversation. And then she proceeded to connect me with a ton of people that she knows, not necessarily in the yoga industry, but just doing really cool things in business. So we had lots of really cool episodes that weren't necessarily yoga teachers. So one of those was marketing for your personality type, which is something I'm super, super obsessed with now. I was also able to talk to people like Jack Fish on creating great sales copy, positive mindset with Corinne Gillen. I was able to have so many cool people on the podcast that I got connected to from Jenny Shi. So that was a really awesome connection. One of the other episodes that I really loved this year was being able to talk to Shannon Roach from Yoga Alliance. Yoga Alliance is definitely a company that you guys have heard me. I've gone back and forth about. I've kind of questioned whether or not I personally align with them, whether or not I'm going to personally spend the money and that sort of thing. And it was really awesome to have her on the show and to be able to talk with her, you know, like firsthand and be able to actually pick her brain and that sort of thing. We did episodes on things like holding space for grief, teaching yoga online, the deities and gods of yoga, which was super fun, authentic selling. I released a bonus consultation call with a client that I worked with for over a year. I got to talk about, you know, thinking outside the box, running online businesses. And one of the highlights for the latter part of this year was getting to talk with Tiffany Cruikshank. And she is somebody who I have followed for a long time. I've followed her yoga journey and her teaching basically since I became a yoga teacher, and being able to have her on the podcast and talk to her was so awesome. She was definitely in my group of yoga teachers that it's sort of like, oh, that would be such a dream to be able to talk to her. And so actually having her on the podcast was super, super, super cool. And I think one of the best parts is that she doesn't feel like a yoga celebrity when you talk to her. She's so down to earth, she's so chill, and she's so awesome. So that was definitely a highlight of my 2019 episodes for sure. And overall, I just feel like it's been such a fabulous year for the podcast. I was excited about every single guest that I interviewed, and every single episode that I was able to put out, I feel like offered something different. And it's been really cool to see the podcast shift over the last couple of years, because when I started, it was very much like, okay, what is the topic from the conversation that I'm having? And I would really plan that beforehand. And now it's sort of like I've talked to so many people and done so many different topics that I'm not going to not talk to somebody because they're a studio owner. Instead, I look at like, okay, what's the angle on this that makes this person's experience unique? And I think that that's one of the things that really helps people learn and grow. At least for me, I've found that hearing one person's story maybe makes me feel like, oh, that's not for me. But then I hear somebody else's story and I'm like, oh, cool, I really love the way that you do this. And it's not because one is better than the other, or one is right or one's wrong, et cetera, et cetera. It's because all of us think and learn and perceive differently. And so it's really cool to be able to hear different sides of things. So that's what really excites me about being able to talk to so many cool people and hear their stories. And so before we dive into what you can expect from 2020, I just want to reflect a little bit on some of my biggest learnings from the year. And one of the biggest learnings that I've been personally grappling with, I think, is this idea of being busy. Like when I think of 2019, I think busy. I think overwhelm. Yet it's all things that I've manifested, that I've brought into my life. And it's all things that I'm really grateful for. When I look back on the year, there's nothing that I'm like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or that brought too much into my life. It's a lot about the balance of what we want and what we bring in, with setting those boundaries and making sure that we make time for our self-care. So that's something that I'm really considering as I go into 2020, is just what that balance looks like. I've definitely been seeking more help lately and passing things off to people who can help me, which has been so great, and something that I would really encourage you guys to do if you're feeling like your 2019 was busy and overwhelming. Is I think that sometimes we manifest, or we say yes to projects, and we bring in all this abundance, and then we feel the sense of overwhelm with it, and it feels really hard to manage. At least that's been my experience. And so, yeah, my biggest learning has just been around shifting my mindset around busy and overwhelmed to what it actually is. And for me, it actually was abundance this year. It was actually feeling this sense of fullness in a really good way, yet allowing that fullness to overwhelm me because I wasn't setting appropriate boundaries. And so one of my big goals for 2020 is to set boundaries. It's not to will less things in my life. It's just to look at how I can set appropriate boundaries. And it's something that honestly I've already started around the holidays, and it's felt so good. So I would definitely encourage you guys to look at where you can set boundaries too. I had lots of big learnings, like I communicated through my yoga teacher training and through my retreat, and I think that those just both opened my eyes towards more of what I want to do in my own business. Obviously, I have MBOM and the business side of things, but I'm also a yoga teacher myself. I just spent thousands of dollars to upgrade my training, and my teaching is also something that's really important to me. And so I've done a lot of the work that you guys are doing with your businesses in my own personal business. And so one of the things that is really exciting about that is that I'm going to be launching a new podcast in 2020. I'll give you more details as it becomes more of a reality. For now, it is in the, I guess, like the late idea phase, and will be coming to life in the early new year. And I think that a lot of you guys will really, really like it. So it's not the business of yoga, but it's definitely still connected to yoga and wellness. And so I'm really excited to share that. And I'm really excited to be taking some steps towards advancing my own personal yoga business as well. I did tons of teaching this past summer, and it really gave me a lot of clarity on where I want to go with that side of what I do. And then, alongside that, it's looking at like how you manage a couple different branches of your business, because I also have, the travel side of things that I do as well. So I'm really looking at like how I can manage my time really wisely, set great boundaries, and also create great content. So those have been my biggest learnings, and I've already mentioned a couple things to look forward to in 2020, but a couple other things that I'm really excited about are the podcast will be continuing into its 4th year. We already have the content recorded for the first couple months of the year, which I'm really, really excited about. There's going to be lots more great interviews for you guys, lots more great topics, lots more great conversations on yoga businesses, and I hope that it can really help you guys understand that you too can be successful in this industry. So I am very, very excited to kick off 2020 with some awesome, awesome episodes. The other thing that I have in the works right now is that I am revamping my signature course, Yoga Business Badasses. Before I did teacher training last year, I had a ton of people go through the program as beta testers. They gave me really, really awesome feedback. And so I'm taking all of that feedback and I'm applying it to make the course even better. So places where there was questions or uncertainties, all that stuff will be answered. Places where videos weren't the best, I'm going to re-record them, and I am super excited to be relaunching that in the early new year as well. So if you already have access to that, don't worry. Everything you paid for will be upgraded. You don't have to pay any more, anything like that. And for those of you who've maybe considered the program but weren't sure if it's right for you, I'll give you more details as things come down the pipeline and as they get more secure. So that's the biggest thing for me in early 2020. I'm sure there'll be lots more coming as we move through the year, but I am super, super, super excited to be spending the first 6 months of the year stable in Panama, just doing some local travel here and really focusing on some bigger work projects. So you can stay tuned for all of that stuff. All right, I think that sums up my 2019 and gives you a little sneak peek into 2020. Obviously, lots more coming in the near future, but I hope that this has encouraged you to also reflect on your 2019. It is so fun to sit down and look at your past year, look at where you've been, what you've done, what you've taught, what you've learned, what you've achieved, and all that good stuff. So if you take away anything from this episode, one, I hope that I'm super, super grateful that you're listening, and two, that you should reflect on your year too and just see how 2019 feels so that you can really head into 2020 feeling super awesome and just ready to conquer this new decade. All right, that is all for me for now. If you guys have questions, comments, feedback, please email me info@mbomyoga.com. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And of course, you can join the private Facebook community at Yoga Business Badasses. I would love to have you there. One final thank you to the sponsors for this episode, Offering Tree and FavYogis. Please go check them out and give them as much love as they give us and the podcast. And I will see you next year. I will be back next Monday for the start of 2020 content, and I cannot wait. Have an absolutely happy new year, and I'll see you soon. Namaste.